King. Minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives, and I always appreciate that opportunity, and it's a right and a privilege of any member of Congress to come down here and address you from this floor about whatever issues might be on our minds. And I have a couple of them on my mind here this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. And one of them is the circumstance that brought about the loss of the Farm Bill here on the floor. And I come from the 4th Congressional District of Iowa. And I'll make the case with anyone in this Congress out of all 435 districts that we produce more agricultural products in the 4th District than any other. There's some folks in the San Joaquin Valley we have an interesting discussion with, and I tip my hat to their progress, but still stand in defense of the 4th District of Iowa. The corn we raise, the soybeans we raise, the pork that we produce, the eggs that come out of there, all of that sets the standard for the rest of the country. And I'm giving the credit to the producers, the families that raised the farmers that we have today, that went off to school and came back with the technology in their brain and developed the technology to bring this kind of crop out of this ground. I have 2 ears of corn down in my man cave, Mr. Speaker, and they're beside each other on a nail. And I'd say half the people in this Congress would guess wrong on which was which. One of them is an open pollinated variety that they used to plant back in 1848. And the other one is a triple stack hybrid that came out of the 2015 crop. Neither one of them irrigated. It's naturally, God's rainfall raised them. And that one ear that's just as big as the other one, and actually it's got more rows around it, is the open pollinated from 1848, and it yielded between 15 and 25 bushel to the acre. And then you look at the 2015 ear, it's roughly the same length, fewer rows of kernels around it, and that yielded not 15 to 25 bushel, but 232 bushel to the acre over the scales. That's how far we've come with agriculture technology. And you can divide your 15 or 20 to 25 bushel into the 230. It's almost 10 times. You might make the argument that we've got 10 times the yield today that we had back when the pioneers rolled across the prairie in their covered wagons and they began to figure out how to bring crops out of this ground. And that's an example of what's taken place. We have tractors running around out in the field now, no markers. The markers used to be planter wire and cross-checked, and then the markers would mark so we came back around and you lined up on that mark from the last round so that all the rows were nice and beautiful and parallel and straight, and everybody took pride in having fields they could look down those rows and see that wonderful crop of corn and soybeans and other crops coming out of the ground. Now there's not markers on a lot of our planters, and some of those planters are running around with the markers folded up because we're being guided by GPS. That's just some of the technology. We're applying fertilizer differently as the soil types change going across the field. We've got an ability to adjust the numbers of corn according to the soil type too. And we're using less fertilizer than we did. We're taking care of the water quality. Lots of good things are coming up out of the ground, and that means the food for America and Americans. And this farm bill is designed to stabilize our family farm operations so that they can stay in business. It's not good enough just to be in business next year, but to be in business next generation. This is the center and the heart and soul of America. This is the American dream, is the family farm on that land, looking back through their generations and seeing they're the 4th generation, the 5th generation family farm, the 6th, the 7th generation. I stood in a machine shed that's had some pretty good feedlots around it and a lot of good farm ground around it, and talked to I saw the 7th generation hadn't quite learned to talk yet, but 7 generations on the family farm. And I've watched them also as they stood there together and held hands and cried as the auctioneer sold off their life's work when we didn't have a program in place that could stabilize their hard work, their smart work, their dedication. Nobody can do this like a family farm can. There's not a corporation that can go out there and hire people and be vertically integrated and somehow get this thing scaled up to the size that they can be more efficient than what's going on right now with our family farms in America. Because when it's in your culture, when it's in your blood, you make hay when the sun shines. In fact, the culture is so strong in my neighborhood. We had a case in court. I was sitting in the courtroom in Sac County a number of years ago, and the lawyers were bickering back and forth, and the judge was deliberating and maybe dithering a little bit. And my lawyer said, "Come on, let's get this done. I got hay down." Well, you got hay down, we know what that means. You got to get it back up again before it rains. And that, when the weather's there, you got to move. And if the sun goes down and you can still go, you keep going because you're looking at the clouds coming on the horizon. By the way, we've got technology to address that too. Now we've got to set up with the technology teamed up with Monsanto and with Google to put together a corporation that watches the weather report and indexes that in and sends a message off to the farmer's cell phone in a text that says, you're going to get 1.5 inches of rain tonight, and you've got 6 hours or 7 hours or 10 or 12 hours to side dress 20 pounds of nitrogen. And that's what your crop needs because we've been monitoring it for these years, and we've calculated the sun days, the heat units, the humidity, and the growth patterns. This is a scientific, now very sophisticated industry, and that's just crop farming. And then you've got the livestock side of this as well. And so we worked long and hard to put this farm bill together here, Mr. Speaker, and of all of the hearings that were held in it, and the big things that we need to make sure that we sustain and extend are crop insurance, number one, because crop insurance is the number one risk management tool for our producers. And if you don't have an ability to insure your crop and go to the bank and be able to predict that you've got a reasonable chance of at least servicing your loan and paying your input costs and taking a few dollars out to feed the kids, if you can't do that, the bankers can't stand with you. And so federal crop insurance is an essential component of our family farm operations. It's not something that they can get along without because we've seen these markets cycle. We've seen the market cycle in these ways where, for example, January 4th, 1980, Jimmy Carter embargoed grain sales to Russia. Excuse me, I'm in the modern vernacular. It was the Soviet Union. All the Soviet Union, no U.S. grain goes in there. They were our number one market at the time. And so that embargo shut off that market for our producers and the farms all across this country. And we saw the commodities prices on the Chicago Board of Trade go into a tailspin. I mean, it nosedived down into the gutter. And to get back out of that and get those markets put back together again didn't really happen in the way we might anticipate. It was not a bounce back. It was a struggle back. We lost family farm after family farm. I watched farm sale after farm sale. I went to those sales. We went in and some of those building sites that the family farm were pushed off of, some of them the acreage was sold off so that somebody had a little cash and they came in and tried to fix up the place a little bit and tried to live there. It worked for some. In fact, it worked where I live. But it didn't work for every. Some of them were burned, some were buried. We did a lot of that. I can drive you around the countryside, Mr. Speaker, and I can point to those places now that you just see as dirt, and I can tell you who lived there, the kids' names that were there, where they went, off to school, maybe Iowa State, maybe the University of Iowa, maybe UNI, also maybe off to the coast somewhere. And too many of our children went off to get an education and didn't look back, and now my neighbors, if they're still neighbors, buy a plane ticket to see their grandchildren. That's the result of what happened when we had the grain embargo in 1980 that was brought to us by Jimmy Carter. And we had subsidies that had to be poured into the Midwest in huge amounts. Even today we'd be stunned if I were to say into the record the amount of money that was put into try to bail out the disaster that we had in agriculture, and land change prices. And CRP came in, and the pick year in 1983, and with that, land prices tumbled down to, I can say, a third of what they were at their peak. And when government stepped in and put CRP in place, some of it was for conservation, and we preserve a significant amount of it in this farm bill. But Mr. Speaker, the taxpayers paid for some of those farms a couple of different times as a result of what happened with the grain embargo in 1980. Well, today we have a trade circumstance, and that trade circumstance started, I believe, with not really the negotiations of NAFTA, but the tariff that the president put on steel and aluminum, and that was globally for all countries that were exporting their steel or aluminum into the United States, a 25% tariff on it. And then after 2 or 3 days, then the president, the Canadians, not as much the Mexicans, but the Mexicans too, objected to the tariff that went on them. They were negotiating NAFTA, and so after 2 or 3 days, the president lifted that tariff off of Canada and Mexico, were the countries that are involved in NAFTA. That, I think, was designed to try to get the Canadians to the table on NAFTA. And perhaps that's been useful and it worked. But we also knew that a tariff on steel and aluminum coming in out of China was going to bring about retaliatory trade moves on the part of the Chinese. And they acted in a predictable fashion. They slapped a tariff on our U.S. ag products from going from the United States into China. And so here I am, Mr. Speaker, representing the 4th Congressional District of Iowa, all of northwest Iowa, almost all of north central Iowa, some of northeast Iowa. And when I look at the map that was put out by Bloomberg that showed the counties in America that went Democrat in blue, the counties in America that went Republican in red, and that would be, of course, the Trump election. And over the top of that, they laid out a focus in, I believe they were yellow dots, and that was the production of soybeans, the concentration of the production of soybeans. And it's clear that the dead center, the center of the hub of the middle of bullseye, those tariffs that the Chinese put on soybeans and pork especially went right into the 4th District and right into Iowa, and then it spreads out, Nebraska, Illinois, Indiana. We all know what the Corn Belt looks like. The soybean belt's a little different, but that's where the most of it is still raised. And so we take this hit in our neighborhood, and our producers are holding together pretty well because they understand that our president is a multifaceted, multidimensional trade negotiator. And so the trade negotiations that started with NAFTA and the tariff on steel and aluminum that included the Canadians and the Mexicans in the beginning for 2 or 3 days are part of also what's happened with the retaliatory tariffs that the Chinese put on especially soybeans and on pork, and that brought the South Koreans to the table too, and they said, give us some relief on the tariffs on the steel. The South Koreans are the 3rd largest exporter of steel to the United States. While they were there, they offered up the invitation they had it in their pocket evidently, for the President Trump to sit down with Kim Jong-un. And the president said, yes, I'll do that. Stuck his head in the press room and told the press, I'm going to meet with Kim Jong-un. Now we're pretty confident that's going to happen in Singapore, June 12th. All of this is wrapped up together, Mr. Speaker, and much more besides: national defense, national security, the denuclearization of the North Korean, or of the entire Korean peninsula, and it also plays into the Iranian nuclear agreement that was signed by, I believe, John Kerry technically, but under the Obama administration. You put this all together, and I'm just given a quick snapshot, Mr. Speaker, on the multiple layers of strategy and negotiations that are part of this president. Meanwhile, the message that's sent overseas to the Chinese, for example, who are putting pressure on the very producers that need to have stability, that need to have their federal crop insurance, and those that need to know that we've got an EQIP program, and those that need to be able to measure what we're going to do with our CRP program, for example, our conservation programs. All of this is only 20% of the overall farm bill, and the other 80% goes to nutrition. And so we've watched as, when I came to this town, there were 19 million people on food stamps, and we called them food stamps then, 19 million. And at the peak of the Obama administration, which would be about the 7th year of the Obama administration, those 19 million on food stamps had become 47 million on SNAP. And the costs to the taxpayer grew, of course, proportionally, and even faster because of the inflationary aspect of this. And so we found ourselves at 2.5 times more people on food stamps than there were when I came to this Congress in 2003. And how do we fund that? We're watching our deficits go sky high, $20 trillion, on the way to $21 trillion in deficit spending. And where do we get the money to pay the bills that are pushing us into the deficit and running up $20 trillion in national debt? not deficit spending, Mr. Speaker. And where do we get the money to service the national debt? And where do we get the money to pay the bills as we watch our national debt go up over $20 trillion? Well, the primary places are China, Saudi Arabia. About half of this comes from the American people investing in bonds and securities. And so we are borrowing money from China to buy people food stamps when there are, and all we ask in this bill is that they work. Now, why should a farmer work and watch the stability underneath him that is the Farm Bill, that is the federal crop insurance piece, that is EQIP, that is a conservation program, that has a MAP program in it, the market access program? Why should that farmer be out there sweating bullets sometimes, wondering if he can make it with markets that are 50% of what they were just a few years ago, when other people aren't working at all? Why should the sweat of the farmer's brow pay for the food of the person that refuses to work? And the American people know this, Mr. Speaker. It's not a complicated thing. If you poll it out there and ask them, 80 to 90% of the American people are they say, yes, you ought to have to work if you're going to eat. It's biblical. It's John Smith's rule. And it ought to be the rule. It is the rule within the culture of the American people. It's just a rule that's hard to get past here on the floor of the House. We don't force anybody off of food stamps. We only look at the people that are able-bodied between the ages, I believe it's 18 to 59. I know it's not any older than 59. And we say, if you want to get food stamps, then fine, we'll give them to you. But you have to work 20 hours a week or go to school 20 hours a week or some combination of your own improvement, 20 hours a week. Well, 20 hours a week, is that too much to ask, Mr. Speaker, for someone to put in 20 hours a week in order to eat for free all the other hours of the week? I think it's entirely reasonable. And furthermore, all work has dignity. All work has honor. All work enhances the character and the work ethic of the people doing it. There's no shame in being productive. There's honor in being productive. But 20 hours a week, that's only a day's work for a farmer that's in the field, that's out there planting corn or planting soybeans or harvesting those beans when you see the weather coming in, or combining corn in the fall. When you go, you go. And there are a lot that put in 20-hour days. And I know because I keep up with them. And so do our crews from time to time. When we have to, you do what you need to do. And so here we are, a bill that's been shot down here on the floor. This is the second time this has happened in the last, I'll say, 5 years. A farm bill comes out here to the floor. We just need some Democrats that will support work, and we would have passed this bill here today. But looking at the roster of those that voted no, every Democrat voted no on this farm bill. And they didn't vote no because they didn't like what was in on the ag side. They voted no because there were work requirements in on the food stamp side. So when I came to this Congress, there were Democrats here that believed in work, and they would vote accordingly. We had about 53 Blue Dog Democrats, moderate Democrats, that wanted to get to a balanced budget. And their agenda was, let's cut some spending and let's raise some taxes, let's get to balance. My agenda was, let's cut some spending and get to balance. But we could do business. And too many of them were forced to vote for Obamacare, and when they did that, they essentially walked the plank, and when they voted for Obamacare, the American people rose up and voted them out of office and put in conservative Republicans instead. And some of those conservative Republicans decided they wanted to leverage this farm bill for a vote on a bill that includes at least 2 components of amnesty. And I'm wondering, where have we gone, America? Where have we gone that we can't take care of our farmers? Where have we gone that we can't require a little bit of work to go along with a lot of free food? Where have we gone when we say that 20 hours a week to get free food, when you ask a farmer to work 20 hours a day when the weather lets him do that, and to suspend his risk management program? At least it's not suspended here technically. I mean, it goes on, but the message is suspended, and the doubt hangs out, and they won't sleep as well tonight, and they won't have as good a weekend. And the people that are getting food stamps without work, they're probably snickering a little bit. They might be sitting on the couch in the front lawn right now going, you know what, those Republicans aren't going to be able to make me work, and all those Democrats are going to protect me so I don't have to work. And I regret the direction that this culture and civilization is going, if work is so disparaged by one party that we can't have a tiny little bit of it plugged in into a fully funded welfare program that went from 19 million people on food stamps in 2003 on up to 47 million at its peak, and now down around 45 and change, as I recall. 45 million people on food stamps. And now another one of these arguments is, well, we have to bring in workers from overseas. That's one of the bills that some of the folks that voted against the Farm Bill today, Mr. Speaker, it's one of the bills that they want to bring to the floor. It brings in guest workers. Well, actually, initially it won't bring them in. It'll amnesty the ones that are here. People that are working illegally here, a lot of them, in fact, I'll say with confidence, with utter confidence, most of them operating on somebody else's Social Security number, guilty of the felony of document fraud, would get a pass to stay in America or do a touchback and come back to America. And you know, the only ones that would leave to do a touchback and come back are the ones that will be pre-certified to have a pre-pass coming back into the United States. 410,000 would get that path in a bill that they want to see come to the floor maybe next week. And there's another 40,000 that would go into food processing. So we've not had guest workers come into food processing. That's low-skilled work as a rule. Now, if you're gonna fill the ranks of low-skilled workers, then I'd suggest that we put Americans to work at that. The highest unemployment rates, the double-digit unemployment that you look at, are the lowest skilled workers. And people say, we don't have anybody in America that's willing to do the work. Well, why not? This is not that complicated an equation. We have there's a disagreement here, but nobody thinks there's less than 70 different means-tested federal welfare programs in this country. Nobody thinks there's less than 70. Some take that number all the way up to 87. But between 70 and 87 means-tested federal welfare programs exist in this country. Not one person has memorized the names of them, let alone understands how they work, how they interact with each other, how they might motivate or demotivate people that we ought to be asking to go to work. And so what we're doing is we're bribing Americans. We're paying them not to work with welfare programs. And if we didn't have anybody out there to pay not to work, and we didn't have that labor, then I could maybe understand the argument that somebody 1,500 miles away in a foreign country that doesn't speak English, that has a 6th grade education and no skills, should be coming into the United States to do some of that work, but that's not the case. We did the chart on this, Mr. Speaker, and I believe I've introduced it into the congressional record. And it works like this. There are it's a big pie chart, and it's out on the internet, but there are 326 million Americans, according to the most recent estimate of the U.S. Census Bureau. And out of them, I ask, what are they doing? Well, there are 153 million of them that are employed. Now, they might be not fully employed, but they're employed. So 153 million of them working. All right, take those off to the side. 7 million of them, though, are on unemployment, drawing unemployment checks right now, right? Just a hair under 7 million. They ought to be going to work. Second one is there are 46 million Americans who are simply not in the workforce. They've opted not to look for a job, not to work, whatever the reason is. Maybe they've already wealthy enough that they don't need to work anymore. They could possibly be in school or enhancing their education. But chances are a whole lot of them are on some of those 70 to 87 different welfare programs that we have. And so they're drawing down some combination of that. Maybe they're working in the black market for cash somewhere and they don't show up on the records. 46 million of them. Then there's another 14 million. They're starting to get a little bit older now, but some of them do want to work and can. That's those between the ages of 65 and 74. Walmart hires at 74, unemployment gets paid at 74, so we put that in there to calculate also, Mr. Speaker. And then there are 23 million Americans on disability. And I can't believe when I see double amputee wounded warriors roll themselves to work every day that all 23 million of those that are on disability payment, that none of them can work. Some can, and we ought to go back and take another look at them. But by the time I add all of this up, there's a couple other lesser categories there. By the time I add all this up, there are 107 million Americans of working age who are simply not in the workforce, and they are in categories that we can hire from every one of those categories. We just can't hire everyone from any of those categories, but starting with unemployment, then the 46 million, and on down the line. So I say to people, if you need one worker, can you find him out of 107 million? If you need 100 workers, can't you find them out of 107 million? If you need 1,000 workers, can't you find them out of 107 million? And of course that answer is yes, they can. Yes, we can. But somehow we have the employment force, the employer force in America that has convinced themselves that they don't want the American worker, and they're not willing to come to this Congress and work with us to tighten down this welfare system. This welfare system was created to be a safety net, not a hammock. And because of these additions to the welfare systems, going up to the 70 to 87 of them, and the benefits coming out of there, people have the safety net has been ratcheted up and up and up till it's become a hammock. And we have tens of millions of Americans that are lying in the hammock. They might be the third generation that's not worked. There was a study that was done, Mr. Speaker, in Milwaukee that carved out a 36 square block residential area of Milwaukee, 6 blocks by 6 blocks, and they went in and interviewed each one of those residents of those households. Now, these are people that came up from the Gulf Coast when they lifted Prohibition in the 30s to take on the good brewery jobs that were formed in Milwaukee. And by the way, the GDP of the beer in Wisconsin today is over $7 billion. So it's a huge industry. But they came up to work there 3 generations ago, and the company that went in to survey every home in those 36 square blocks came to this conclusion. There wasn't a single employed male head of household in any of those homes in 36 square blocks in Milwaukee, 3rd generation. Why not? They moved up there for the jobs. The story lamented that we couldn't bring jobs to them. I read it and thought, if their grandfathers could move up there for jobs, why can't they go to where the jobs are? There are plenty of jobs in America. And the reason they can't is because they're rooted in the home. The home may be paid for or partially paid for, and they've established themselves a comfort zone on a welfare system and supplement it however they need to get to that place where they're in a comfort place. We don't need to have policies that encourage that. We don't need to have people that haven't worked in 3 generations. We need to have the industrious, can-do American spirit driving an economy and free enterprise and being rewarded for the work they do. And I don't any longer put out any statements that say hardworking Americans, hardworking Iowans. There are a lot of hardworking Americans and hardworking Iowans, Mr. Speaker, but it's also important to work smart. I want to see smart working, hardworking people all over this country, and our job needs to be to increase the per capita GDP, the average per capita GDP of our people. And that comes about by starting with work on food stamps and taking that philosophy, make it a success, and move it over into many of the other welfare programs. Another one is, can take all of those welfare programs, the 70 to 87 of them that are there, converge them all into one committee here in Congress, and then start dropping off the ones that aren't working and measuring them and shake it all down to about 5 different programs instead of 70 or 87 of them. Those things will work, but we are here today with a farm bill that went down on this floor. It went down because no Democrat supports work. It went down because some Republicans wanted to leverage this farm bill in order to get a bill out on the floor to vote on that has within it 2 components of amnesty. And I oppose amnesty because it destroys the rule of law. When Ronald Reagan signed the Amnesty Act in 1986, he only let me down 2 times in 8 years, and I revere that man and his legacy, but I believed that as the debate went on in the House and the Senate, that Ronald Reagan would see with utter principled clarity that if you reward lawbreakers, you're destroying the rule of law, and there'll be another amnesty and another, and more people will come for it. And they have, and there have been 6 minor amnesties since that period of time, but this is the big one sitting here. amnesty for people that are in America illegally, amnesty for DACA recipients. They say they came here when they were 3 years old and their mother led them across the Rio Grande River. I actually have seen the data. I don't know if any other member of Congress, I don't believe, has seen the data. We've been digging it out for months on end, and I think I'll soon be able to make it public. Some of them were brought here at 3 years old. Some of them were girls at that age. Some of them it was their mother. But that doesn't represent that universe of DACA recipients. And what I do know is of those large numbers, especially of males that came here illegally, they were 14, 15, 16, and more years old, that they knew what they were doing and they were responsible for what they're doing. I want to restore the rule of law, pass a farm bill, and I want to get people back to work, and I want to have allies on this floor that support work, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields.
Motion?